Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today we have our reporter on the ground, Max Bergman, in Europe, because we're going to talk about this week's Munich Security Conference, which Max will attend. He has been in Brussels and he's been in Paris as well, so lots of great insights to come. But Munich is big, of course, as always. There's going to be nearly 50 heads of state and government from around the world meeting in Bavaria to discuss European security and defense, all pretty relevant issues at the moment. After that, we'll turn to Max's conversation with Marcus Roberts, who's CEO of Mandate, to discuss European polling trends and what they portend for the year ahead. We hope you enjoy the show. Max, as I said, you are on the ground getting your finger on the pulse of European vibes ahead of Munich, which will be on February 13, 14, and 15. We're expecting a lot of people there. As I said, 50 heads of state, 100 foreign and defense ministers, a lot of delegations from Germany and France and the US as well. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is expected to be there. So we're going to see a lot. This obviously comes on the heels of Davos, where we saw a preview, I think, maybe of the vibes. So tell us, what does it look like over there?
Yes. Coming to you on the ground with a baguette in my hand, a beret on my head from Paris, was in Brussels earlier this week. I think there is a degree of trepidation about what Munich portends. The Munich Security Conference last year, seen, I think, as kind of this rupture moment where J.D. Vance, in giving a speech where it was really a domestic policy speech, where he was admonishing the CDU and other German parties for not working with the AfD, attacked Europeans for freedom of speech and other things like that. And it was quite a shocking speech for Europeans. And then, we had Davos a few weeks ago, which what was, I think, really striking about Davos, obviously there was Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, gave this sort of speech talking about essentially a rupture in the global order. And, Davos is normally where you talk economic policy, not sort of the global order questions. That's usually reserved for Munich. But it kind of, I think, set the stage for, are we in kind of a new world order where the US and Europe are sort of no longer on the same page? And so when we think ahead to Munich, kind of reminds me of 2007 when Vladimir Putin came to the Munich Security Conference and used the forum as a venue to basically declare his antagonism towards the West and that Russia and the West were going to be adversaries. And that is sort of seen in the kind of arc of Vladimir Putin as sort of the seminal moment. And I wonder if, when I look ahead to the Munich Security Conference, are we going to see that again? It's Marco Rubio coming. It's not J.D. Vance. Marco Rubio, I think, is less confrontational toward the transatlantic alliance. But my guess is we're going to see quite a bit from him to sort of show his MAGA credentials, and I probably agrees with it, that will hit Europe on some of their tech regulations and other economic issues. But I bet we'll probably see a little bit of language there that pays homage to the transatlantic alliance, that I think there'll be something there for the NATO hands among us that want NATO to sort of stay the way it is. There'll be something there for them to hang their hat on.
Yeah, and we saw from also the Munich Security Report that comes out along with the conference that the framing of it very much is like, let's be honest, like destruction of the order that we've seen so far. They're calling it wrecking ball politics instead of careful deliberations, things that we've been used to, that I think a lot of the practitioners and leaders who usually go to Munich are not really used to and are still really grappling with. As you mentioned at Davos, it was kind of the first big one where we heard someone like Mark Carney put into words the shift that we seem to be in the middle of. Interestingly, I was in Canada this past weekend, and some of the ads on TV by the government of Canada are really interesting. It's like, we're a nation of builders. We are opening more jobs. We want to trade with the world. The message is extremely clear. And they're really trying to, I think, put some meat behind the words that are being said. The report, I think, is correct. It feels like, I mean, this is kind of a tired quote, but I think it's right. It's really like Antonio Gramsci's interregnum. We're in between these two orders. And right now is, as he wrote it, the time of monsters, trying to figure out what comes out of this and some of the speeches that we're going to see, but also the dynamics between some of those leaders, I think are going to tell us a lot. I think one thing that I'll be looking for is these mostly European leaders who are going to speak, at least from our corner of the world. They need to do a lot of things at the same time to assert, European independence and autonomy, and at the same time defend a certain kind of world order, whatever they can salvage from it. But at the same time, that puts them at risk of becoming defenders of a status quo that their own citizens are unhappy with. So it's a really tricky balance. I'm not saying that everybody in Europe watches the speeches from the Munich Security Conference, but it makes its way into the news. And so they have a really tricky balance to walk. And I think different leaders are also going to come with a different message. Like, we're probably going to hear something different from von der Leyen than we are from Mark Rutte, because we've heard different things from them for the last few weeks. So those are some of the things I'm going to be looking for.
I think the big question and problem facing Europe is that I think there's a general agreement with the Mark Carney speech. President Trump's designs on Greenland created a real shock, in a real sense, that the US and Europe, that maybe this is no longer a marriage worth saving. And in fact, maybe the marriage is already over, and that there's, a divorce is happening, and that it is really time that Europe has to reckon with the fact that it cannot rely on the United States to defend it. And then you start to look at, well, what needs to be done then, right? And that's the hard part, is that it's in some ways easier for Europeans to just try to hang on to the idea of the marriage, even if it's over and it's not working, to just still pretend to be married. And in some of my engagements in Brussels and other places, like that vibe, that sense is still very much there. Because when Mark Rutte went to the European Parliament and said, if there is no European pillar of NATO, what are you talking about? It doesn't exist. And he's right. It doesn't exist. And so then there's this question of, like, do you build a new life? Do you build a new, a European pillar? But that's super hard. That means, like, all these countries have to talk with each other. They have to, maybe use the EU, but the EU doesn't do defense. And so you have all these basic problems of European cooperation coordination in the defense and foreign policy space that have never really been addressed, because they've never had to since 1949, since NATO was founded. NATO absolved Europe from having to work together and coordinate. They'd work through us on defense. And so while the Europeans all work together through the EU and empower the EU on economic policy, that's just not happened on defense and foreign policy. And there are questions about whether it can happen. I have a piece in Foreign Affairs this week. It's called Europe Needs an Army. If I had to title it, I would say Europe Needs a Pentagon, that there needs to be this movement for Europeans to work together. Andreas Kubilius, the European Defense Commissioner, has really pushed in this direction as well. And the EU is now doing a lot on defense, but it's still, if you think about the dangers now confronting Europe with an active war in Ukraine, with the US not being reliable, how long would it take for Russia to really modernize its military? If, let's just say, the war dies down in Ukraine, I don't think you even need a ceasefire, just dies down. It could be a few years where suddenly a threat to the Baltic states becomes very real. And in our conversation earlier this year with Michael Kaufman, that puts Europe this huge bind, because it militarily doesn't work together. And so that's a big structural reform, but maybe you don't have time for that big structural reform. So maybe you just really try to do everything to keep the Americans in. This is the sort of really difficult strategic choice. So it's going to be interesting at Munich, because what you are starting to see is Europeans being more ready to punch back. I think one of the lessons, as we've talked about, Davos, was that the Europeans stood up for themselves. So I think you're going to see this sort of push and pull. Do Europeans get more uppity, defending themselves, standing up for themselves? And then are there others that are, in the Ruto lane of, we just need to not cause a rift and just get through this, right? So there's a real tension now, I think, between those two approaches, and we'll see how that works at Munich.
But let me ask you this then, because yes, we're going to be watching for a lot of things, but is Munich then mostly a rhetorical exercise? Because we talk about this conference every year. There's a lot coming out of it. Obviously, last year was special because the vice president, JD Vance's speech was such a shock. Sometimes there's real action repercussions coming from the conference, but do you think this could be also a place where something is going to happen coming out of it? Or it's mostly an exercise in seeing if Europeans will be more uppity, will push back more, and maybe create some of the connections with other parts of the US delegation, for example, Congress members that are coming?
Look, I was very dismissive of the importance of Munich until I got an invitation to go to Munich. And
Oh,
now
funny how that works.
the way I would think about conferences like these is that these are conferences to take the temperature of the moment, right? These are the things that historians love. 25 years from now, and you're trying to understand, like, what was the mood in Europe during the Trump administration? You go to big conferences like these, like that Davos, I think, will be in the histories of our present. And Munich, similarly, because you can look at what they're saying, see how the language has shifted. What are they saying now that they weren't saying a year ago? And so it's a way to take the temperature of the global order, of the global environment. How freaked out are people? When you think about Munich from in 2022, Russia invaded right after Munich. There was a sense of total foreboding at that Munich Security Conference. I wasn't there, but that was the vibe that you could pick up when observing it. And so I think it's going to be interesting. Is there a sense of total foreboding that America is abandoned Europe and it's now facing, a future where it has to deal with Russia basically on its own? Or is there a sense of like, okay, well, transatlantic relations have been through a lot. There's a huge congressional delegation coming, and my guess is that congressional delegation is coming to provide a lot of reassurance that America still stands with NATO and with Europe. And so does that sort of take the edge off and actually, there's some bipartisan splits within the administration and lead to a sense of, okay, we don't need to do some of the deep changes that might be necessary for Europe to defend itself if America's not going to be there.
I think that's a helpful way to phrase it. I used to think a lot with these conferences, same thing with Davos, if you'll allow me the pop culture reference. This moment in Titanic where Rose explains to Jack at the dinner, like with the men, like they will retreat into like a cloud of smoke and congratulate each other on being masters of the universe. Like that's the big vibe for me. But this year is more like, oh, we've hit the iceberg. Let's see where all these people are running to. Are they grabbing the life vest? Are they actually trying to organize, get the boats ready? That's the image that's in my mind.
I think that's a good frame for this. The other thing that is also happening this week is just there's a European Council summit where the Italian Prime Ministers Draghi and Letta, our former prime ministers, talk about European competitiveness. And the other aspect here is there going to be kind of an economic push of real reforms and changes to both implement these two reports, but to sort of drive Europe forward? Because part of this whole issue is that, Europe needing to get its economy moving and in its defense structures moving. One other thing to watch out for is Sarah Rogers, who's the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy, one of the most notable undersecretaries for public diplomacy, I think probably in the history of the transatlantic relationship, is coming to Munich. And I think there's going to be a big conflagration, most likely, over European tech rules, tech policy. And I think that's a spark that I'm sort of looking for. And the other thing is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman, notable from her sort of progressive, for being one of the most notable progressive politicians in America, is also coming to Munich. A lot of people are excited to see what she's going to say on foreign policy and the transatlantic alliance. So, there's a lot of interesting things happening because that will sort of maybe point to what is the future of a democratic foreign policy when it comes to Europe and the transatlantic alliance.
Yes, definitely a lot of exciting guests coming and a lot of tea leaves to read. And I think you made a really good point. For Europeans, a lot of it is connected to competitiveness and economic growth. That connects back to also what we were talking about at the beginning. They have responsibilities to their own citizens and publics who are asking for a lot. So there's going to be a lot of things to look for all these leaders. This is a great place to transition to your conversation with Marcus Roberts to talk about how Europeans are feeling and what we're likely to see in this coming year.
We are thrilled to welcome Marcus Roberts back to the Eurofile. Marcus is the CEO of Mandate, which provides strategic advice, public opinion research, modeling, and analysis services to political parties, nonprofits, media, and research institutes across Europe. He was previously the chief of public data at YouGov. Marcus, welcome back to the show.
Max, it's a pleasure to be here. Love to be on the show and really excited and terrified about the conversation topics we have to cover today.
So what we want to talk about today is to sort of get a laydown of the current sort of map of European politics, where things are headed. And maybe we could start by looking at what is the kind of current polling landscape in early 2026 in Europe. What are some of the most significant political trends that you're observing across the continent and what's changed from a year ago? And maybe just to provide a little bit more context, there's constantly this narrative of the far right is always rising, at least in the Washington discourse about Europe, always on the cusp of power. But, when we look at elections or when we look at the political situation in the United Kingdom, where Reform and Nigel Farage's party looks like is the polling as the top party, the National Rally in France also polling as the top party. They have an election next year in 2027. And then Germany, the AfD, which looks continuously incredibly strong in polling. So, what is your kind of frame for how you are viewing European politics right now? Maybe top level.
Thanks, Max. Always great to start with a softball. What I'd say is that 25 saw from the German federal elections through a host of other regional elections across the continent. Yes, a rise in support for the far right, but the far right falling short of its own expectations. And this is really important. You remember that Elon Musk weighed in heavily in the German federal elections last year on behalf of Alternative for Deutschland, the far right party in Germany, AfD, only to see AfD begin to seriously underperform almost as soon as he endorsed them. Now, causation is not necessarily correlation, as the XKCD cartoon will teach us, but it still does point out that the far right's grand integrated master strategy or conspiracy is not as powerful or as successful as they would have us believe. What I think is going on, especially as I think about elections in the continent this year and going into some major elections in Spain and France at some point for Spain between now and autumn of 27 and France next year, of course, is that polarization and fragmentation are the two big forces that are driving politics right now. Now, what do I mean by that? Polarization is in an era of fear of the far right on the left and an era of fear of the left in general on helping fuel the far right. These two forces become angrier and more concerned about each other, thus driving greater support for forces that clearly oppose one or the other. And that can be a bit of a problem for traditional social democratic or traditional Christian conservative blocs in the middle. So that's the polarization factor. At the same time, there's a fragmentation factor. Whether you think it's because of social media, whether you think it's because of a politics that is more about politics and less about policy or ideology or grand projects, whether you think it's because of litmus tests, we see a greater degree of fragmentation in our politics. And especially that's exemplified not only by European proportional representation style electoral systems, but also even in the UK by first past the post. What that means is that there are multi-party democracies going on now, 5, 6, 7 parties vying for power. And yet, as our friends in Norway demonstrated in the re-election of Jonas Støre, the Norwegian Labour Party last year, the centre can still hold if it has a compelling story, if that story is in the service of strategy, if it's underpinned by good electioneering and campaign data, it can still overcome this fragmentation and get to a win. That's certainly what Magdalena Andersson's Swedish Social Democrats are going to be hoping for as they head into their election in September of this year. So yes, we've got multi-party democracy going on in form of fragmentation, 5 to 7 party elections. It means that winning these elections can often a result of getting 20 to 35% of the vote or anywhere in between. Very remarkably small numbers for those of us used to total majoritarian proper winner takes all systems. But set against that is this polarization factor. And what is beginning to happen as you see the far right and the new left playing off of each other.
That's an incredibly interesting overview. It seems like then there's sort of a discrepancy between, or maybe we have to think differently about European countries based off of their voting system. So if you have kind of a first past the post system like in the UK or a presidential system like in France, does that change how you're thinking about this? In the UK, it does seem like we're seeing fragmentation, and yet it behoove the Nigel Farage and Reform to try to kind of move to the center somewhat. In France, it does seem that
there's basically a 60 there, or at least there has been a 60% majority against the far right. It's not necessarily for any particular candidate, but it is against the far right. And so does it seem like we're seeing the National Rally, in order to get from 42% to 50%, they're trying to move to the center? How do you think about the UK and France in this context?
Yeah, so I think the median voter has shifted in all of these countries. The median voter now tends to be more concerned about traditional social democratic issues of economic fairness, is more left wing on the economy in general, definitely more interventionist when it comes to wanting the government to intervene in the market and stop market unfairness and support the little guy. So that has definitely happened to a significant extent compared to the world pre 2008 and the Great Crash, and far more left wing in terms of median voters' views of the economy than back in the 90s. At the same time, median voters still have a lot of concerns, not just around immigration, but around borders. And here is the idea that the far right are tapping into. What they want to do is always conflate the border issue with the immigration issue. They want to say that the borders are open and therefore our society or our economy is being ruined by immigration. And yet, what smart politicians are doing all over the world, from Anthony Albanese with his successful re-election campaign to an extraordinary landslide result in Australia, through to what I think we saw with Jonas in Norway, and what I imagine we've got a good chance of seeing with Magdalena Andersson, the Swedish Social Democrats, later this year, is they're beginning to separate the border issue from the immigration issue. Because whilst voters are worried about borders being open, they'd quite like to be respectful and kind and positive towards immigrants who get to their countries legitimately and legally. But the far right wants to conflate these two. They want to say the border's open and therefore we should be terrible to immigrants. And what I think centrist politicians of the centre left and the centre right need to do is say borders should be secure, and that will allow us to be respectful and proper and friendly to our new immigrant neighbours and friends. And that's the way out of that particular trap that the far right's trying to set, even as the median voter is more concerned about that. So how that plays out in France is that, yes, there's this majority of opposition to the National Rally. There's this fear that either, whether it is Le Pen as a result of her current injunction against standing being overturned, or whether it is Jordan Bardella even leading the party into the presidency, it is not enough for French politicians to continually say that you have to vote for us, for me, or else the Republic will fall to the far right. That is a big problem and a big reason why each French president basically fails, because they seek mandates that say, my mandate is based upon not being the other guy. In my opinion, is a big reason why Kamala Harris had such a problem running against Donald Trump, because her argument essentially came down to, you have no choice but to vote for me because the alternative is terrible. And voters really don't like to hear that. They'd quite like to hear what you're for, not just what you're against. So in French presidential politics, I think the challenge is to define what a successful French presidential alternative to the far right is in favor of, not just who they're against. And I think there are lessons in this to be learned around the median voter's view of the economy, the median voter's view of borders and immigration, that do open up a path to a majority support, albeit of a different political nature than was the case a generation ago.
And so maybe let's dive into the UK. You're based in the UK. What is happening right now in UK politics? And, we're recording on Thursday, February 5th. There's some talk about Keir Starmer being in trouble due to Peter Mandelson and the Epstein files. Where do you think UK politics is headed? It does seem that reform has kind of gobbled up the traditional conservative Tory party, at least is the dominant party on the right side of the aisle. And the Greens in the UK look like this sort of new resurgent party that is stealing some of Labour's thunder. How do you see the fragmentation right now in UK politics?
You've said the right word there, which is here we see this fragmentation and polarization effect in play right away. We've seen the rise of Zach Polanski, the new dynamic leader of the Green Party in the UK. And he says you don't need to accept any moral compromises. You just need to oppose Nigel Farage and you can have billionaires pay for everything. So there's no need to make any hard decisions in government. And that is very attractive at a time in which Nigel Farage is the big threat on the bloc and Keir Starmer's government is failing in terms of its lack of story, its lack of strategy, its lack of emotional connection with voters, even as it is proving in office to be really significant left-wing government in terms of a policy agenda of economic interventionism, of public service investment, of pro-worker policies from workers' rights through to significant minimum wage increases. But that once again shows you that a policy agenda, whilst necessary, is not sufficient. And if you don't have a good story, then your policy agenda will get eaten by politicians who do have good stories to tell. And both Nigel Farage on the far right and Zach Walensky on the new left have good stories to tell. They have stories to say, and they're telling it in the context of UK politics that sees reform on roughly 30%, the Greens in the mid-teens, Labour and the Tories both at about 20%, and the Liberal Democrats in low double digits, high single digits. This is really fragmented politics. You can win an election with 30, 31, 32% of the vote, even though it's a first past the post system here. And the solution to that for the Greens and Farage is easy. Just keep fighting the other to amp up your own side. Whereas the solution for the Conservatives and the Labour Party is more difficult, which is how do you get a hearing in an attention deficit economy in which there are people to your right or to your left saying more exciting, more extreme things all the time, and you're stuck with either the compromises of current government in the case of Labour or the heavy baggage of the previous government in the case of the Conservatives. And that's posing to be a very difficult strategic challenge for both Labour and the Tories at the moment, and a big opportunity for the Greens and Nigel Farage's latest vehicle, known as the Reform Party, on the far right.
We're years away from the next UK election, but it does seem that if we sort of get into a UK election in which the landscape is so fragmented, is the side that wins the one that maybe coordinates amongst these different parties? And I say the side, obviously I think it would seem that a coalition between Reform and the Tories and Green, Labour and Lib Dems, do you think that there's a potential where, okay, Labour is not going to run a candidate in this seat, we'll sort of cede it to the Greens, or the Greens have the best chance of winning there, and vice versa? Do you think there will be some sort of tactical coordination? Because that basically lends itself to sort of absorption, something that we've sort of seen on the center left in Dutch politics, where the socialists and the Greens have kind of merged. Do you think that is where things will end up? Maybe it's too speculative down the road, but that seems in a first past the post system the only kind of way forward here.
Yeah, I think that that's a really strong position to take to understand how tactical voting is going to shape the next election in the UK, regardless of a right or left win. And to my mind, that's really far less about pacts between parties and far more about voters self-sorting, about voters understanding who is best placed to usually beat the far right and voting for them. And we saw in the Netherlands, as you referenced, in their elections at the end of October of last year, the success of D66, the small insurgent New Left Party, which basically broke out at the right moment and said, we are a good alternative to Geert Wilders and the PVV of the far right. And the same thing could happen in the UK. Big strategic danger, to my mind, for the UK Labour Party is that they see those anti-reform, anti-Farage, anti-far right credentials to the Greens. That would represent essentially an existential threat to UK Labour, were that to be the case. One of the best ways out of all of this is to, as I say, be not just against someone, but be for something. And to have leaders who emotionally connect with voters and tell stories that are resonant to the economic pain that voters feel at the moment, to their insecurity about borders, to the need to move the immigration debate on from the nastiness of the far right and into something more sane and kinder and more respectful that is possible when borders are actually controlled in the first place, and understands that the economy itself has been screwed against working people for a very long time and needs major structural reform. Big structural change, as Elizabeth Warren used to say. In all of these respects, there is a politics that is waiting for UK Labour there if they have the right story, the right storyteller, the right emotional connection with voters. And as Keir Starmer's travails in office show, it's not enough to just have the good policy. You've got to have more than that. And it's not enough to just be the anti-reform party. There's going to be a by-election at the end of this month In Manchester, the Labour Party had an opportunity to recruit as its candidate the extremely popular, most popular Labour politician in the country, the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham. It decided to use all of its powers to stop him from being the parliamentary candidate. This is a big mistake, in my view, because even if you think that Andy Burnham is opposed to Keir Starmer and wants his job, which he almost certainly does, it's better, as Lyndon Johnson would say, to have them relieving themselves on one side of the tent rather than the other. So there's that. But there's also the fact that you just need your big hitters on the front line when you're facing an existential threat from both the left in the form of the Greens and a threat to your country as a whole from the far right. And so their decision to not have Andy Burnham come back in that by-election might cost them badly if they lose that seat to either Nigel Farage's Reform Party or Zach Plansky's Greens.
I want to ask you about the state of the center left in general in Europe. You advise a lot of center left parties, and it strikes me that the center left is kind of down right now, that there's not as many center left leaders. There's, of course, Mette Frederiksen in Denmark, Pedro Sanchez in Spain. Both have sort of varying views on how to approach immigration and migration.
Varying views is a very polite way of putting it, Max.
Yes, yes. Sweden's going to have an election. The Social Democrats are the largest party. It looks like, they might come back. But it does seem that the center left has sort of lost a trick here, that they didn't do well. They underperformed in the Dutch elections. The SPD and the Greens in Germany last year, I think predictably did not fare all that well. What's going on here? On the Green side, especially in continental Europe, is it that they basically got their agenda implemented with the Green Deal and there's been a bit of counter reaction? Or is the center left just sort of kind of at sixes and sevens about where they are and in making kind of a case to the public? Or am I wrong? Or is the center left, about to be resurgent? What is your take on the state of the center left?
The center left has become addicted to technocracy and to all the reasons why the state can't do things and all the reasons why government is difficult and why everything will take longer and be harder than you think. And the center left is never happier than when it's explaining to voters why something is harder and more difficult, will take longer, cost more money, or can't happen at all. And as a consequence, the center left seems somewhat surprised when voters then go shopping somewhere else for someone with an actual vision and some optimism. Center left needs to get past that. And I would say that your two examples, Mette Frederiksen in Denmark and Pedro Sanchez in Spain, are two great examples of two incumbent prime ministers who are doing just that. Mette Frederiksen has risen to the moment in terms of the Greenland crisis as the prime minister of Denmark and is standing up to America's extreme bout of imperialism over this matter. And as a consequence, she has seen her personal approval rating jump by 21 points, according to the latest YouGov survey, over the course of just 2 months. Voters like what they see when they see someone standing up for their own country, even in the face of as big a bully as the President of the United States over the Greenland matter. So that's one example of a leader who's not playing it safe. Another example is Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain. He's seen his approval rating increase more humbly by 5 points over the course of the last 2 months, according to that YouGov polling. But it's notable nonetheless. This is a guy who's been an incumbent for over 7 years in an extremely polarized and fragmented political environment, and yet he's putting points on the board for himself and for his party right now in what could very well be as a result of his de facto lack of majority in the Spanish parliament. This could be an election year for him. Now, how has he done that? Well, he is capturing and tapping into the energies of the new left very well. He's not allowing space to grow on his left flank. He's taking that energy with a pro-immigrant agenda, very different from Mette Frederiksen's borders and migration crackdown policies in Denmark. He's tapping in with great success to workers' politics, with more action on pay, on housing, on the economy in general. Critically, he's picking fights. He's picking fights and he's naming bad guys, especially Elon Musk and the American tech establishment. And only this week, he's been using the full weight of his prime ministerial office to say that X and social media platforms that are practicing hate speech, that are seeking to sow division in Spanish politics, that are exacerbating problems of adolescence for young people online and making it, as he would say, the internet unsafe for our daughters and our children in particular, won't be tolerated by the Spanish government. and that free speech doesn't extend in the internet to the right to either incite violence or to boost rates of self-harm amongst young people. This is a strong position that he's taken, pitching a big fight against Musk and the US tech establishment. And as a consequence, the Spanish people are responding to it because he's not being a milquetoast social democratic technocratic leader saying change is just too hard. Sorry about that. You have no choice but to keep voting for us because the alternative is the far right. Instead, both he and Fredrickson, in their own ways, are seizing the initiative and they're pointing the direction to the country that they want to lead their peoples to, not just the country they are stuck governing.
I think that's a great segue to the role that you think Donald Trump, this administration, may play in European politics going forward. We've already seen kind of a Trump backlash in some elections around the world, particularly in Canada with Mark Carney. It looked like, Justin Trudeau was deeply unpopular. It looked like his successor was definitely going to lose the election in Canada last year. Trump sort of intervenes. It's then hard for the leader on the right to sort of distance themselves from Trump and create space for a centrist, center-left leader to emerge. Do you think Trump is going to be a big factor in European politics this year, next year? If you had asked me this time a year ago, I'd said, of course, Trump's going to be a big factor in European politics in 2025. I'm not sure if we actually saw that. In some ways, I don't think we really have. So what is your projection? I mean, do you think that we're going to start seeing more European politicians basically try to have that kind of Love Actually moment where, Hugh Grant stands up to Billy Bob Thornton, the sort of Tony Blair character pushes back on George W. Bush, and that there's sort of more confrontation because it's in the political interests of European politicians? Where do you think European politics is headed, at least? Where's the political trajectory here when it comes to perhaps confrontation with our president?
When you're telling your story in politics, it's not enough to just talk about the country you want to live in or the hero that you want voters to see you as being. You got to have a villain. And I would say that it's a very poor choice of villain to say it's just your political opponent. Everyone always expects you to say that the bad guy in the story is the person you're running against. And also that creates a bit of a problem, as we touched on earlier, which is the moment you defeat that opponent at the ballot box, your story is kind of complete. If the villain's dead, then there's no point to your government anymore. As Keir Starmer found out when he vanquished the Tory party, he'd made the Tory party and Rishi Sunak the only villain of his story. And so upon election, there was no point to his story continuing. Now, Donald Trump is a very attractive villain for European left-wing politicians, a very attractive galvanizing force. Donald Trump polls extremely badly across Europe, and not just at the top line level, but even amongst far-right voters. Indeed, he is underwater in his popularity rating, even amongst Nigel Farage reform backing voters in the UK. So Farage has a Trump problem. All far-right leaders in Europe have a Trump problem. And Trump at the same time, deserves credit for doing something that pollsters such as myself just find extraordinary, because at Mandate, we regularly track leader ratings and popularity of different foreign leaders in different countries as well. And one of the things we noticed recently is, of course, that somehow he's managed to take his minus 82 number of favorability in Denmark and taken it to minus 90. Now, I didn't think it was actually possible to reach minus 90. I'm quite curious as to the last remaining three Danes who do have a positive rating.
A reverse Stalin-esque poll.
It's a pretty extraordinary result, but you fly across the continent quickly. In France, he's at minus 56. In Italy, he's at minus 52. In Spain, he's at minus 58. In the UK, he's at minus 59. In Germany, he's at minus 66. And those, by the way, are the conservative estimations. You could run up on, according to some polls, even higher in terms of his negatives than that. So I think European politicians of the left are going to be telling a story of their own politics in their own countries that features villains, and features villains who aren't just their far-right leaders in their countries, that features villains like Elon Musk, like Mark Zuckerberg, and like Donald Trump. And you're going to see more of that being the push against them, even as it helps them define what they are for in terms of whether it's the long, slow march towards European tech, economic, and military sovereignty, and eventual decoupling with America, even if that is a generational project.
I want to maybe take that and sort of project forward. France is having elections next year. The far right is the largest party. I think there's sort of been this assumption that they're kind of inevitably going to win. France has 2 rounds of presidential elections. Given, right now it's not clear who's going to emerge as the sort of major alternative. How do you think this is going to play out in French politics over the next year? And maybe just your prognostication there. And then I have one more final question after that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that for France, the players to watch, obviously on the far right, we've already touched on. But on the other side of the fence, it's worth following if the center right end up being the standard bearer for the anti far right in France, it'll probably be in the form of Edouard Philippe, former prime minister. If the center left end up being the standard bearer of the anti far right force, I would watch Raphael Glucksmann, a French MEP, a member of the European Parliament, who has had a pretty good run at breaking out from the pack over the last few months and showing the prospect of something a bit different. Now, the field is wide open. We've got over a year until we arrive at the election. We're very much in the invisible primary stage of all of this, seeing how the forces coalesce around these different candidates. But those would be 2 of the ones that I would watch. I'd also say that I'd be remiss in not remembering that, of course, we've got a very important election later this year in Hungary as well, where the godfather of contemporary far-right politics, Viktor Orban, is once again for the 573rd time on the ballot. And in that case, polls currently show that he's about 8 points behind with his Fidesz party against the main opponents in the TISA bloc. I would say that will be a very hard job for the opposition to overcome Viktor Orban. He has all the powers of incumbency and uses them ruthlessly and relentlessly, whether it's through addressing the cost of living crisis in the form of helicopter money, literally sending more money out to voters to say, hey, here's more cash, don't worry about cost of living, or gerrymandering his parliament ruthlessly to ensure that even if he loses the popular vote, I would say by as much as 3 points, he probably still ends up as prime minister. So yes, the opposition in Hungary have a shot at it, but it will be really hard for them to translate that shot into success because, as I say, they've got to clear that 3-point margin that Orban has built into the system, but it is well worth tracking Hungary this year as well.
Yeah, the Hungarian election, it's, I think, set for April 12th, so in about 2 months from now. We'll definitely be doing some more episodes on that. One final question. We talk a lot about European defense on this podcast, and there's been increasing calls for the EU to get involved in defense, for a European army, for Europeanizing and having the EU sort of protecting Europe, especially since the United States is not seen as reliable. I'm curious if you've done polling or looked at European attitudes on defense and security and how that's playing right now in European politics.
I wish we had set this question up because it's so perfect. Mandate is just about to go into the field next week with a new multi-country survey on European defense attitudes, following up on our previous work 1 year ago to see how things have changed on that matter. I would say that defense is a rising issue across the board as a result, even less of Russia and more about America. And this is just an extraordinary change in the world. And when I think about why leaders like Jonas Støre in Norway won their re-election, or why I think Magdalena Andersson in Sweden for the Social Democrats has such a good chance in her election in September of this year, it's because they are strong and trusted on defense. And they're strong and trusted on defense, not in the old way of the transatlantic relationship is everything, but in the new way of we're not going to ditch the transatlantic relationship overnight, but we are going to talk much more about burden sharing, about developing our own capacities, about resilience, about European munitions markets and development plans in arms and hardware, about interoperability. And Magdalena Andersson, as a former prime minister, has that kind of weight and gravitas that she brought in when she helped steer the early and most critical, most delicate stages of Sweden's own membership of NATO into being. And that makes a big difference for her in the eyes of voters because they do feel that the world is more dangerous. They do feel it's more dangerous because of Donald Trump's America. And they're looking for leaders who have a different vision for how things can be in the future and a much bigger role for European defense in the form of burden sharing. I think it's going to be a big part of what voters are fishing for in the elections to come. Not as important, obviously, as cost of living as the super issue, not as important directly to people's worries over borders and migration, but a significant, almost like a hygiene test of your fitness to be a leader is whether you've got an idea of how you're going to make your country strong enough in an era of such American unpredictability. And I would look to leaders who have that vision for a more European approach to this as one of the tests of that. Although in a few weeks' time, when we get the mandate research back, I'll be in a better position to actually answer that question with some numbers as well.
Well, Marcus, we're going to have you back. Thanks so much for joining us on the Eurofile.
A real pleasure, Max. Very best, and thanks again.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.